Hello BookTube. Today I am reviewing Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann, subtitled The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI. Now, as much as I hate to admit it, I'm a bit of a Johnny-come-lately to this book. It came out in 2017. It was, I guess, very well reviewed at the time. I never heard of it until the movie came out. So you probably heard of the movie, right? It came out last year, I believe, directed by Martin Scorsese, starring Robert De Niro and Leonardo DiCaprio. Now, as of the time of this filming, I actually haven't seen the movie yet. I'd like to see it one day, but haven't seen it yet. But I heard about it last year when it came out. I watched the previews on YouTube, I read reviews of it, and it got me interested in this book. And the more I dug into it, the more it sounded like this was a really interesting book. And the author, David Grann, apparently has done a number of interesting historical narrative works, narrative histories. So he's definitely somebody I'm going to have to check out more because I really like good narrative histories. And it looks like I've got some catching up to do with this author. So this book's been on my radar since about last year when the movie came out. I've been waiting for a good opportunity to read it. And now that I'm back in the United States, my mom actually had a copy of this book on her bookshelf and recommended it to me. I mean, I was planning on reading it anyways, but my mom also recommended it to me. She said it's a real page turner. And yeah, it was a real page turner. If you've not read it yet, this is a really interesting book. If you like narrative histories, you're going to love this one. It's an interesting story. It's an important story. It's got a number of hooks in it, and it just keeps you turning the pages. So, yeah, like I said, I was attracted to this book because I knew about the movie, but I didn't know a lot about the movie. I read some reviews, I saw the trailers on YouTube, but I didn't know in depth. So I had a vague idea about what some of the characters were, but didn't know it in depth. And that's kind of the ideal state to go into reading this book. The book is set up like a mystery. So you're reading the first few pages and you're seeing the mystery unfold, and you don't really know where it's going to go, and there are a number of intriguing possibilities thrown out there as you're following the characters unraveling the mystery. And the author sets us up great, like a narrative, where at the beginning of the story, you don't know where this mystery is going. And the characters don't know where the mystery is going either, so you're kind of discovering things as the characters discover them. Now, it is all history, so you could just go to Wikipedia and find out what the mystery is. And as it's kind of slowly burning this mystery, as you're reading the book, there is a temptation to just go on Wikipedia like, I just want to know who's behind it. And again, I had seen the trailers for the movie, so I had some idea maybe the character played by Robert De Niro would be behind some of this, but I haven't seen the trailers recently. It was something I saw last year and I haven't seen recently, and the book is structured in a clever enough way that a lot's hidden from you at the beginning when you're just kind of slowly reading this through. So I guess all that is to say maybe a couple things. One, to a certain extent, the less you know about this going in, the better. I mean, I think it would be an interesting book regardless, but definitely the sense of mystery would be greatest the less you know. And two, maybe along with that, take that as a spoiler warning. I mean, I know this is a history book, But maybe if you haven't read it, stop watching the review now. Don't go to Wikipedia. Don't read anything about this book. Just order this book from your library or off of Amazon, and then read it, and then maybe come back to this review, because I will be spoiling things here. So the book is set up, I think, into maybe 4 sections. The first section is a true crime story about the murders that were going on. And this is well done narrative history. So it's all told like a story. First we get the reports of the murders, then we get the reports of the investigation. There are a lot of private eyes investigating the murders. And it's murders in the plural, because as the story goes on, there are more and more murders that occur. And it sort of climaxes with a whole house being blown up. And the way it's described, this is a huge explosion that rocked the whole town. And as you're reading through this book, you're thinking, why haven't I heard about this before? This sounds like it must have been a really big deal. And in fact, to kind of jump ahead a little bit in the narrative, it was a really big deal at the time. National headlines in the time. To jump ahead to the trial, apparently the trial that resulted from these murders, according to the book, had more national publicity than the Scopes monkey trial, which had happened just the year before. This all happened in the 1920s. So it was a really big deal at the time, but it just completely got forgotten about. Now, why did it get forgotten about? Well, I've seen a couple reviews of this book which say probably racism is one of the reasons it got forgotten about, because this was oppression of the Indian people, and it's not something that people want to talk about in the history books. And perhaps that's one of the reasons. Being a bit of a history buff myself, though, I think anyone who reads a lot of history finds out that there's a lot of interesting stuff in history that just gets forgotten about for one reason or another. It's a reminder that as we're living through the present days, so often there's so much stuff going on that you think, oh boy, they're really going to remember this 50 years from now or 100 years from now. But in a lot of cases they won't. I mean, they'll remember it in the sense that it will be in the archives and it'll be in the library and stuff like that. But it won't get taught in schools. A lot of the stuff that's going on today. I mean, think just even the past 5 or 10 years, right? How many big, huge news events from the past 5 or 10 years are barely remembered even now, right? Sorry, that's a little bit of a digression. Back to the book. So that's the first stage, the murders that are going on. Then we get to the FBI investigation. So there was some local investigation going on, but the locals were unable to solve this. So then the FBI got involved. And this is where it gets interesting. Well, no. It was interesting before, but this is where a new layer of interest is added. Because now we have some new narrative threads, the birth of the FBI. So there's an FBI man who's sent out to investigate, but Hoover, who is J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, is also very invested in getting this case solved because of the FBI's reputation and prestige. And this is right at the formative moments of the FBI, where if the FBI can look good solving this case, it's going to bolster Hoover's position of power. And if the FBI does not solve this case, then it's not going to look good for Hoover. And Hoover is at a tentative point in his career where his position could either be made or broke, make or break. So that makes it interesting. But there's also a shift in perspective. And it's cleverly done because up until this point, there are some characters who we think are on the side of good, who are actually trying to solve this mystery. But then once the FBI becomes involved, then we find out that actually some of these characters have been portraying themselves as trying to solve the mystery, but actually they've been hindering the investigation. And that information has been kept from the reader because we're meant to just discover this as the characters themselves discovered it. And so then that makes you just reevaluate all the information you got in like the first 100 pages when you get to the introduction of the FBI. Then the third part is the trial. Now, once all the evidence is assembled by the FBI, you kind of think, okay, the story is over. They've got more than enough evidence to lock these guys away. But turns out there are a few more twists and turns left to come because there's a lot of shenanigans that go on during the trial. And one of the things I guess we learn in the course of this narrative is how completely corrupt the justice system in Oklahoma was from the top down. So much so that the jury tampering, bribing juries, all this cronyism in the political establishment. And some of this was happening against the backdrop of a corrupt presidential administration with Harding and the Teapot Dome scandal, which is a little bit in the background of this book. So there are a number of interesting things to ponder while you read this book. But certainly one thing you ponder is how much is corruption just a part of our American institutions? Because, we are living through a period now where it seems like just everyone is corrupt and none of the politicians can be trusted. And there's just so much blatant, corruption in our political system. And reading this book, you think to yourself, wow, 100 years ago, and this book takes place just about exactly 100 years ago. There was so much corruption in our political system. And you think, did we go through a period in like the 50s and 60s where we had kind of rooted out corruption before it came back with Nixon? And then did corruption disappear again? Is corruption something that just kind of comes in and out of our political system, or is it always there and we just pretend it's not there sometimes? So as one of the philosophical questions you ask yourself as you're reading this book. The other philosophical question which you can't help but ponder as you read this book is human nature. Because, you want to believe that human beings are basically good with, a very small percentage of sociopaths or, the criminal element, which is a very small percentage of society. But reading this book, it gives you a picture of a very corrupt and violent society, at least in Oklahoma at the time, which was not limited just to the criminal class, which included a lot of people in the establishment. And very evil. They did a number of very evil things. And as you're reading this book, you think, is that just how humans are? If they're or is that? The thing that kind of gives you a little bit of faith in human nature as you read this book is that a number of the other characters in the book are so appalled at what happens. So, when this all comes to light, the other characters or historical figures in the book are asking the questions that you, the reader, are asking as you read this, which is, will human beings really do this just for gain? Are humans capable of such callous disregard for life just for monetary gain? And the fact that the other historical contemporaries in the book are just as shocked by this as you, the reader, are, I guess gives you some restored faith in humanity as you're reading the book. And of course, the other thing that's hanging over all of this is the racism question, which is addressed directly in the book. Because the victims of these killings were Indians, does that help the murderers to justify the killings? But certainly, as you're reading this book, you're also getting the sense that there is a lawless society at the time, kind of, I guess, the last vestiges of the Wild West, which the Indians are one of the many victims of, but there are also just a lot of violent elements just out in society at large. And then the last part of the book is where the author inserts himself into the book and talks about his process of researching the book and the things he uncovered when he was researching it, and talking to the descendants of the people who were featured in the book, because this was only in the 1920s, so the grandchildren of the people in this book are still living, it's an interesting change in the perspective of the book. It goes into the first person as the author is talking about his own research and the interviews he did. But the other thing is he talks about how during the course of this investigation, he finds out that there were these sensational murders that grabbed the headlines. But behind this, there was a much larger system of murder. A lot of quiet killings that didn't make the headlines, but a lot of Osage Indians dying in mysterious circumstances. That was all largely ignored at the time. So, it was, when you're reading about the sensational murders, you think these are just like an isolated incident. But then at the end of the book, you find out that this was not an isolated incident. There was, I don't want to say it was a systematic killing, because it sounds like it wasn't so much a system as just a lot of opportunistic individuals. But there was a culture, maybe a culture of killing the Osage Indians going on at the time. Obviously, it's somewhat of a depressing book to read, but it's also a very fascinating book. I've talked about this before, but just to maybe recap why it's so fascinating. It's a historical incident, and an important historical incident, and one that is about the experience of the Native Americans in this country. But the hook is it's presented as a true crime. So, true crime, for better or for worse, is something that we humans find fascinating. I guess we are morbid creatures. So the hook is this true crime story, which, at least in the beginning of the book, is presented just as a true crime story. The murder happens, the uncovering of the murder, the private detectives who are hired to unravel it. And then onto that, we get this becoming a national incident. So we have the politics of Washington, D.C., the FBI becoming involved. J. Edgar Hoover becomes very interested in this case. And then we have the media circus, or the media attention, that then latches onto this case, and then the whole political aspect of it. So you start off with a true crime story, and then the layers of interest just keep piling on until you've really got quite a substantial, interesting, historically important story, which is told in the best traditions of narrative history. So I would highly recommend this book. And chances are you've heard of the movie already. I don't know how much you already know about this book. But yeah, like I said, it's worth tracking down if you haven't read it already. And probably you've read it already. Like I said, I'm coming to this book late. But if you haven't read it already, definitely recommend.